So I'm now reading chapter 3 of the same book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And you guys, I have to say, my god, chapter 2, wow. I know I didn't finish it in my video, but I did finish it, and there were so many things I learned. So many things. The one I want to talk about, because I was not aware of this. I did not know this was a thing. But basically, okay, so you know how, like, if you were to get arrested, you get read your Miranda rights, and they say, you have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you. Did you know that in certain states, that whole idea of, like, if you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you, if you make a certain amount of money, they will deny your right to like a public attorney or to a public defender. For example, in the state that I live in, I looked it up, and let's say, like, for a one-person, single-income household, whatever, if you make more than $33,000, you will be denied a public defender. I couldn't believe that. It's just crazy. I guess at the time that this book was written, and I didn't, like, do further research for this specific state, but in the book it said, like, in the state of Wisconsin, for example, if you make more than, I want to say it was 3,000. Let me double check my numbers here. Let me see, because I can't remember. Yeah, $3,000. Okay. If you make more than $3,000 a year at the time this book was published, anyway, in the state of Wisconsin, you will be denied a public defender. Let's just sit with that for a moment. I didn't know that. I always assumed that if you, like, the whole idea of, like, if you cannot afford one, one will be appointed to you. I always assumed that, like, you made that call as to whether or not you can afford one. And even if you couldn't afford one, that you could still ask for a public defender because you have the right to an attorney. I misunderstood that right to an attorney aspect. Right to an attorney just means you have the right to legal representation. Now, how you get that is up to you. And if you make more than X amount of money, we're not giving you that legal representation. But yeah, crazy. I did not know that. And I spoke to my fiance about it, and he said the same thing. He's like, I had no idea. I mean, not that we would know, like, we have first-hand knowledge of that, you know. None of us are attorneys, so we don't have first-hand knowledge of that, but still, it's just, I'm just curious if that's, like, a widely known thing, because all of us know, like, you have the right to an attorney. Like, we all know, like, yeah, if you get arrested, you could get a lawyer, but yeah, I didn't know, like, your state makes the rule on, well, if they consider you to have money or not. So anyway, okay, there was a lot more. I learned more about, like, how, like, local law enforcement was incentivized to really ramp up this war on drugs. I learned about how local law enforcement, I didn't know that they get to keep, like, the profit, if you will, or, like, yeah, like, they get to keep, like, the property or, like, the profits off of the, that's not the right word to use, profit's not the right word to use, but, like, all of the seized property, they get to keep it. That's pretty crazy. And I learned about how, like, in that case, they believe that the property itself is guilty, and apparently that's a thing. Kind of, I guess. The book explains it as being, like, a very archaic legal concept of, like, property, like, being guilty or innocent, I guess. And how hard that can be for you to, like, get your property back. And, like, when I say, like, the property is involved in, or what I mean by that is, like, property was involved in, like, drug activity, like, it can be as simple as, like, you have a friend who was was using in your car. And now they take your car despite the fact that you have no criminal charges because you were not using. But your car was involved in it, and now it's been seized by the government. And you know, have to try to find a way to get it back. And because it's a civil case at this point, it's no longer a criminal case because you don't have criminal charges. You have to find your own attorney for that. And it's very easy for the government to argue that, you know, it was used during, it's not even like, you know, like, it's not even like that car is being used for an investigation, right? Like, it's just that it just so happened that, you know, there were drugs being used in the car, and they can just take your car. You know what I mean? It's not like they're, like, oh my god, it's so infuriating. Like, it's just, that doesn't make any sense. Okay, whatever. Anyway, so yeah, that, and then the other thing I learned about, maybe I already said it, I can't remember, but it was mandatory minimum sentencing, and how just insane that whole ordeal is. It's just crazy. It talked about one specific case. I can't remember the guy's first name. I want to say it was Leandro, but last name is Andrade. And this man, unfortunately, due to the mandatory minimum sentencing in California and the 3 strikes law, or whatever you want to call it, for stealing videotapes, he was sentenced to 50 years in prison without probation. I want to say his first charge was like something non-violent. I could be wrong, but I really feel like when I read about it, because I did further research on it, like after I read the chapter, his first charge was something non-violent. Maybe. I could be wrong. I don't know. I can't remember now. But anyway, obviously the next 2 charges that he got, because he went to like one Kmart, stole some videotapes, and then a few weeks later went to another Kmart, stole more videotapes. But yeah, he literally got 50 years in jail, in prison, sorry, with no probation. And he did have, like, they tried to appeal it, and they went to the Supreme Court and argued that it went against his 8th Amendment rights, which is like, you know, no cruel and unusual punishment. And, oh my fucking god, the justice, I think it was like Sandra Day O'Connor, had the gall to argue that the sentencing was not disproportionate. I can't imagine saying that. That's not disproportionate. Okay, 50 years no probation for stealing. Oh, I want to say, like, the amount of money stolen, like, from the videotapes or whatever is like, I really think it was like less than $500. So you could spend 50 years in prison. That sounds like something from like medieval days, where it's like they put you in prison for the rest of your life for stealing a piece of bread. You know, like, oh my god. Anyway, so yeah, I learned about that. I also learned about how, like, the whole 3 strikes thing got really popularized, and it gained a lot of momentum for, like, that legislation to pass was because of a kidnapping case that happened in California. And this guy, the kidnapper slash killer, he was in and out of jail for like many years. And I think right before he did the kidnapping and all that stuff, he was in jail for like 13 years or something like that. And that helped to really propel the legislation for the three strikes thing. The little girl who was kidnapped, her father came out after the fact, like after the whole 3 strikes law. And I mean, really just like because it's very, like, controversial. But he didn't add to the controversy, I guess you could say. Like, he like came out and said that he didn't agree that it was a good thing that the 3 strikes law was being used for those who didn't have violent offenses. Like, he was like, you know, he understands the difference between like a kidnapper and, like, you know, someone who's stealing food for their family. Like, he didn't think like you need to go to jail for a minimum of 25 years for that. It's ridiculous. Which, side relaxing stuff. Here's your warning. I'm sorry, this may not be super relaxing. Okay. The color of justice. Imagine you are Irma Faye Stewart, a 30-year-old single African-American mother of two who was arrested as part of a drug sweep in Hearne, Texas. All but one of the people arrested were African-Americans. You are innocent. After a week in jail, you have no one to care for your two small children and are eager to get home. Your court-appointed attorney urges you to plead guilty to a drug distribution charge, saying the prosecutor has offered probation. You refuse, steadfastly proclaiming your innocence. Finally, after almost a month in jail, you decide to plead guilty so you can return home to your children. Unwilling to risk a trial and years of imprisonment, you were sentenced to 10 years probation and ordered to pay $1,000 in fines, as well as court and probation costs. You are also now branded a drug felon. You are no longer eligible for food stamps. You may be discriminated against in employment. You cannot vote for at least 12 years, and you are about to be evicted from public housing. Once homeless, your children will be taken from you and put in foster care. A judge eventually dismisses all cases against the defendants who did not plead guilty. At trial, the judge finds that the entire sweep was based on the testimony of a single informant who lied to the prosecution. You, however, are still branded a drug felon, homeless, and desperate to regain custody of your children. Now, place yourself in the shoes of Clifford Reynolds, another African-American victim of the Hearne drug bust. You return home to Bryan, Texas to attend the funeral of your 18-month-old daughter. Before the funeral services begin, the police show up and handcuff you. You beg the officers to let you take one last look at your daughter before she is buried. The police refuse. You are told by prosecutors that you are needed to testify against one of the defendants in a recent drug bust. You deny witnessing any drug transaction. You don't know what they are talking about. Because of your refusal to cooperate, you are indicted on felony charges. After a month of being held in jail, the charges against you are dropped. You are technically free, but as a result of your arrest and period of incarceration, you lose your job, your apartment, your furniture, and your car, not to mention the chance to say goodbye to your baby girl. This is the war on drugs. The brutal stories described above are not isolated incidents, nor are the racial identities of Irma Faye Stewart and Clifford Reynolds random or accidental. In every state across our nation, African Americans, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, are subjected to tactics and practices that would result in public outrage and scandal if committed in middle-class white neighborhoods. In the drug war, the enemy is racially defined. The law enforcement methods described in Chapter 2 have been employed almost exclusively in poor communities of color, resulting in jaw-dropping numbers of African Americans and Latinos filling our nation's prisons and jails every year. We are told by drug warriors that the enemy in this war is a thing, drugs, not a group of people, but the facts prove otherwise. Human Rights Watch reported in 2000 that in 7 states, African Americans constitute 80 to 90% of all those sent to prison on drug charges. In at least 15 states, blacks are admitted to prison on drug charges at a rate from 20 to 57 times greater than that of white men. users and dealers nationwide are white. 3/4 of all people in prison for drug offenses have been black or Latino. In recent years, rates of black imprisonment for drug offenses have dipped somewhat, declining approximately 25% from their zenith in the mid-1990s. But it remains the case that African Americans are incarcerated at grossly disproportionate rates throughout the United States. There is, of course, an official explanation for all this. Crime rates. This explanation has a tremendous appeal before you know the facts, for it is consistent with and reinforces dominant racial narratives about crime and criminality dating back to slavery. The truth, however, is that rates and patterns of drug crime do not explain the glaring racial disparities in our criminal justice system. People of all races use and sell illegal drugs at remarkably similar rates. If there are significant differences in the surveys to be found, they frequently suggest that whites, particularly white youth, are more likely to engage in illegal drug dealing than people of color. One study, for example, published in 2000 by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, reported that white students use cocaine at 7 times the rate of black students use crack cocaine at 8 times the rate of black students, and use heroin at 7 times the rate of black students. That same survey revealed that nearly identical percentages of white and black high school seniors use marijuana. The National Household Survey on Drug Abuse reported in 2000 that white youth aged 12 to 17 are more than a third more likely to have sold illegal drugs than African American youth. Thus, the very same year, Human Rights Watch was reporting that African Americans were being arrested and imprisoned at unprecedented rates. Government data revealed that blacks were no more likely to be guilty of drug crimes than whites, and that white youth were actually the most likely of any racial or ethnic group to be guilty of illegal drug possession and sales. Any notion that drug use among blacks is more severe or dangerous is belied by the data. White youth have about 3 times the numbers of drug-related emergency room visits as their African American counterparts. And listen, taking a little time out here for a moment, that within itself is something to think about because, the opioid epidemic and how it's, primarily like a white epidemic, like, there's some, like, that should be talked about, like, why is there such prevalent drug use amongst, like, white youth? Addiction is a disease. Okay, back to the book. The notion that whites comprise the vast majority of drug users and dealers and may well be more likely than other racial groups to commit drug crimes may seem implausible to some, given the media imagery we are fed on a daily basis and the racial composition of our prisons and jails. Upon reflection, however, the prevalence of white drug crime, including drug dealing, should not be surprising. After all, where do whites get their illegal drugs? Excuse me. Do they all drive to the ghetto to purchase them from somebody standing on a street corner? No. Studies consistently indicate that drug markets, like American society generally, reflect our nation's racial and socioeconomic boundaries. Whites tend to sell to whites, blacks to blacks. University students tend to sell to each other. Rural whites, for their part, don't make a special trip to the hood to purchase marijuana. They buy it from somebody down the road. White high school students typically buy drugs from white classmates, friends, or older relatives. Even Barry McCaffrey, former director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, once remarked, "If your child bought drugs, it was from a student of their own race generally." The notion that most illegal drug use and sales happen in the ghetto is pure fiction. Drug trafficking occurs there, but it occurs everywhere else in America as well. Nevertheless, black men have been admitted to state prison on drug drug charges at a rate that is more than 13 times higher than that of a white man. The racial bias inherent in the drug war is a major reason that 1 in every 14 black men was behind bars. Oh my god. 1 in every 14 black men was behind bars in 2006. Jeez, that's a lot. Compared with 1 in 106 white men. For young black men, the statistics are even worse. 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 35 was behind bars in 2006, and far more were under some form of penal control such as probation or parole. I don't know the difference between probation and parole. Let me look that up. I thought those words were used interchangeably. Difference between probation and parole. Nevada Board of Parole Commissioners. Let's see. Parole is the term used to describe offenders that have been incarcerated in a prison facility and released prior to the court-imposed expiration date. Parolees serve their time in the community and can be returned to prison for violating any of the conditions of parole. Excuse me. Probation is a term used to describe offenders that have been convicted of an offense but whose prison sentence is suspended. Okay. Probation is very similar to parole, except the probationers have not served prison time or their suspendeds have not served prison time on their suspended sentence, and the sentencing judge maintains jurisdiction over the probationer. So probation is when you went. Probation could be like, wait. But prison sentence is suspended. Probation is very similar to parole, except that probationers have not served prison time. Okay, so probation, you didn't go to prison, you're just on probation. Parole is when you've gone to prison. I'm not even joking. Like, I just seriously kind of like thought you could use those interchangeably for some reason. This is why we read people. Gotta educate yourselves, because you're out here making yourselves look like a fool using those words synonymously as if they mean the same thing they don't. I wanted to go back in the book really quickly to be like, okay, so it says parole now that I understand what that word means. I also have to take a moment here to, whatever. I'm not gonna say that. Yeah, parole. Okay, parole is when you've gone to prison. Okay, yep, so far more are under some form of penal control such as probation or parole. These gross racial disparities simply cannot be explained by rates of illegal drug activity among African Americans. What then does explain the extraordinary racial disparities in our criminal justice system? Old-fashioned racism seems out of the question. Politicians and law enforcement officials today rarely endorse racially biased practices, and most of them fiercely condemn racial discrimination of any kind. When accused of racial bias, police and prosecutors, like most Americans, express horror and outrage. Forms of racial discrimination that were open and notorious for centuries were transformed in the 1960s and 1970s into something un-American and affront to our newly conceived ethic of colorblindness. By the early 1980s, survey data indicated that 90% of whites thought black and white children should attend the same schools. 71% disagreed with the idea that whites have a right to keep blacks out of their neighborhoods. 80% indicated they would support a black candidate for president. Wow. And 66% opposed laws prohibiting intermarriage. Only 66 opposed that. Whoa. That's crazy to think that from the 60s to the 80s that changed. That's like, wow, okay. Although far fewer supported specific policies designed to achieve racial equality incarceration, such as busing. The mere fact that large majorities of whites were, by the early 1980s, supporting the anti-discrimination principle reflected a profound shift in racial attitudes. The margin of support for colorblind norms has only increased since then. This dramatically changed racial climate has led defenders of mass incarceration to insist that our criminal justice system, whatever its past sins, is now largely fair and non-discriminatory. They point to violent crime rates in the African American community as a justification for the staggering number of black men who find themselves behind bars. Black men, they say, have much higher rates of violent crime. That's why so many of them are locked up. Typically, this is where the discussion ends. The problem with this abbreviated analysis is that violent crime is not responsible for mass incarceration. As numerous researchers have shown, violent crime rates have fluctuated over the years and bear little relationship to incarceration rates, which have soared during the past 3 decades, regardless of whether violent crime was going up or down. Today, violent crime rates are at historically low levels, yet incarceration rates continue to climb. Murder convictions tend to receive a tremendous amount of media attention, which feeds the public's sense that violent crime is rampant and forever on the rise. But like violent crime in general, the murder rate cannot explain the growth of the penal apparatus. Homicide convictions account for a tiny fraction of the growth in the prison population. In the federal system, for example, homicide convictions account for 0.4% of the past decade's growth in the federal prison population, while drug convictions account for nearly 61% of that expansion. In the state system, less than 3% of new court commitments to state prison typically In the state system, less than 3% of new court commitments to state prison typically involve people convicted of homicide. Roughly half of the people in state prisons are classified as violent offenders, but that statistic can easily be misinterpreted. The term violent offender can apply to people who have been convicted of a wide range of crimes, from fistfights to armed robbery to rape or murder. The general public seems to imagine that our prisons are filled with rapists and murderers, but they actually account for a small minority of our nation's prison population. Equally important to understand is this: the fact that half of a state's prison population is comprised of people who are labeled violent offenders does not mean that half of the people sentenced to prison in that state have been convicted of violent crimes. This may seem counterintuitive at first, but if you pause to consider how the system actually operates, this fact becomes obvious. People who are convicted of violent crimes tend to get longer prison sentences than those who commit non-violent crimes. As a result, people who are classified as violent offenders comprise a much larger share of the prison population than they would if they had earlier release dates. A hypothetical scenario may help here. Excuse me. Picture in your mind a prison hallway lined with cells, 10 on each side, that are occupied by people for varying lengths of time. Imagine that each cell holds 2 people. One side of the hallway is reserved for people who have been convicted of drug or property crimes and who have relatively short sentences of 5 years or later. 5 years or fewer. The other side of the hallway is reserved for people who have been convicted of violent crimes and sentenced to 10 years or more of life or life imprisonment. During a single decade, more than 100 people could cycle in and out of the cages reserved for people convicted of non-violent crimes. On the other side of the hallway would remain people convicted of non-violent crimes. Okay. While the same 20 people who are locked up for violent crimes on the other side of the hallway would remain in place. At any given moment, if you were to snap a picture of that hallway, half the people living in cages would be classified as violent offenders, but this picture would wildly distort your understanding of the population that had been sentenced to prison during the past 10 years. Although prison hallways are not segregated in this fashion, some version of this dynamic occurs in prisons across America, jails were convicted of lesser offenses. The most important fact to keep in mind, however, is that debates about prison statistics typically ignore a key fact. Most people who are under state supervision and control are not in prison. Of the nearly 7.3 million people currently under correctional control, only 2.3 million are in prison or jail. The rest are on probation or parole. And now I know what probation and parole are. Wait, let me quiz myself. Okay, probation is when you didn't go to prison and you're like on probation. Parole is when you went to prison and you got out like on early, kind of like you didn't serve your time until its expiration or whatever it said. Okay. How long is the video so far? Okay, I'm curious. Okay. More than 4 million people are on probation in the United States, roughly twice the number in prison, and only 19% of them were convicted of a violent offense. Well, okay. Yeah, okay, sorry, and only 19 of them were convicted of a violent offense. Similarly, the overwhelming majority of people on parole were convicted of non-violent crimes. Excuse me, sorry. The most common offense for which people are placed on probation or parole is a drug offense. Even if the analysis is limited to felonies, thus excluding extremely minor crimes and misdemeanors, non-violent offenses predominate. Only about a quarter of felony defendants in large urban counties were charged with a violent offense in 2006. Nevertheless, politicians, law enforcement officials, and journalists routinely create the false impression that most people branded criminals have been convicted of violent crimes. They point to the current composition of state prisons as proof for this imagined fact, ignoring that sentencing practices distort our understanding of who is placed under state control and why. The lie that most people sent to prison are violent offenders is dangerous because it perpetuates the false notion that our system of mass incarceration is primarily concerned with violence. It's not. And that it is well designed to keep people safe. In fact, the system is primarily concerned with the perpetual control and marginalization of the dispossessed. None of this is to suggest that we ought not to be concerned about violent crime, nor is it to say that we should not care about people serving time for violent offenses. We should care deeply about all people impacted, including people who live in fear of violence, people who are survivors, and people who commit violent crimes. Often these categories overlap, since nearly everyone who engages in violence first survives it. If we truly want to end violence in our communities, we must come to understand, as discussed in the final chapter. Okay, that's a weird thing to put in the book. As discussed in the final chapter, the ways in which mass incarceration increases, not decreases, violence and multiplies its harms. But at the same time, we ought not be misled by those who insist that violent crime has driven the rise of this unprecedented system of racial and social control. The uncomfortable reality is that a literal war has been waged on our most vulnerable communities, and convictions for relatively minor, non-violent offenses have propelled mass incarceration. In many states, including Colorado and Maryland, people convicted of drug offenses now constitute the single largest category of people admitted to prison. People of color are convicted of drug offenses at rates out of all proportion to their drug crimes, a fact that has greatly contributed to the emergence of a vast new racial undercaste, a system of mass incarceration that governs the lives of millions of people inside and outside of prison walls. These facts may still leave some readers unsatisfied. The idea that the criminal justice system discriminates in such a terrific fashion, when few people openly express or endorse racial discrimination, may seem far-fetched, if not absurd. How could the war on drugs operate in a discriminatory manner on such a large scale when hardly anyone advocates or engages in explicit racial discrimination? That question is the subject of this chapter. As we shall recent years, the design of the drug war effectively guarantees that those who are swept into the nation's new undercast are largely black and brown. This sort of claim invites skepticism. Non-racial explanations and excuses for the systematic mass incarceration of people of color are plentiful. It is the genius of the new system of control that it can always be defended on non-racial grounds, given the rarity of a noose or a racial slur in connection with any particular criminal case. Moreover, because blacks and whites are almost never similarly situated, given extreme racial segregation in housing and life experiences, trying to control for race in an effort to evaluate whether the mass incarceration of people of color is really about race or something else. Anything else is difficult, but it is not impossible. A bit of common sense is overdue in public discussions about racial bias in the criminal justice system. The great debate over whether black men have been targeted by the criminal justice system or unfairly treated in the war on drugs often overlooks the obvious. What is painfully obvious when one steps back from individual cases and specific policies is that the system of mass incarceration operates with stunning efficiency to sweep people of color off the streets, lock them in cages, and then release them into an inferior second-class status. Nowhere is this more true than in the war on drugs. The central question then is, how exactly does a formally colorblind criminal justice system achieve such racially discriminatory results? Rather easily, it turns out. The process occurs in two stages. The first step is to grant law enforcement officials extraordinary discretion regarding whom to stop, search, arrest, and charge for drug offenses, thus ensuring that conscious and unconscious racial beliefs and stereotypes will be given free rein. Unbridled discretion inevitably creates huge racial disparities. Then, the damning step: close the courthouse doors to all claims by defendants and private litigants that the criminal justice system operates in racially discriminatory fashion. Demand that anyone who wants to challenge racial bias in the system offer, in advance, clear proof that the racial disparities are the product of intentional racial discrimination, i.e., the work of a bigot. This evidence will almost never be available in the era of colorblindness because everyone knows, but does not say, that the enemy in the war on drugs can be identified by race. This simple design has helped to produce one of the most extraordinary systems of racialized social control the world has ever seen. Sorry, I had to cough. Okay. Alright. Now I'm yawning. Alright, here we go. Okay. Picking and choosing the role of discretion. Chapter 2 described the first step in some detail, including the legal rules that grant police the discretion and authority to stop, interrogate, and search anyone anywhere, provided they get consent million illicit drug users compared to 1.5 million drug arrests and 175,000 people admitted to prison for a drug offense. The ubiquity of illegal drug activity combined with its consensual nature requires a far more proactive approach by law enforcement than what is required to address ordinary street crime. It is impossible for law enforcement to identify and arrest everyone who commits a drug crime. Strategic choices must be made about whom to target and what tactics to employ. Police and prosecutors did not declare the war on drugs, and some initially opposed it. But once the financial incentives for waging the war became too attractive to ignore, law enforcement agencies had to ask themselves, if we're going to wage this war, where should it be fought, and who should be taken prisoner? That question was not difficult to answer given the political and social context. As discussed in Chapter 1, the Reagan administration launched a media campaign a few years after the drug war was announced in an effort to publicize horror stories involving black crack users and crack dealers in ghetto communities. Although crack cocaine had not yet hit the streets when the war on drug was declared. In 1982, although crack cocaine had not yet hit the streets when the war on drugs was declared in 1982, its appearance a few years later created the perfect opportunity for the Reagan administration to build support for its new war. Drug use, once considered a private public health matter. Interesting. Drug use, once considered a private public health matter. Wow, I never thought of it as a private public health matter before. Like, that's how, like, drug use has been, like, so, like, but that's true. It should really, truly be, like, a health matter, not like a law enforcement legal matter. Okay, anyway. Was reframed through political rhetoric and media imagery as a grave threat to the national order. Jamie Reeves and Richard Campbell show in their research how the media imagery surrounding cocaine changed as the practice of smoking cocaine came to be associated with poor blacks. Early in the 1980s, the typical cocaine-related story focused on white recreational users who snorted the drug in its powder form. These stories generally relied on news sources associated with the drug treatment industry, such as rehabilitation clinics, and emphasized the possibility of recovery. Focus on white recreational users and these stories generally relied on news sources associated with the drug treatment industry. Okay, like drug treatment, I'm meaning like drug recovery treatment. Okay. By 1985, however, as the war on drugs moved into high gear, this frame was supplanted by a new siege paradigm in which transgressors were poor non-white users and dealers of crack cocaine. Law enforcement officials assumed the role of drug experts, emphasizing the need for law and order responses, a crackdown on those associated with the drug. My brain is starting to turn off. It's 12 in the morning right now. Okay, I read that. I understood that wrong. Law enforcement officials assumed the role, meaning like they took on the role for these drug experts. They are not, right? Like, you know, I guess drug experts honestly should be those who work in healthcare. I think about drugs, it's pharmacology people, you know, like, that's who should be in charge of it, not, you know, a law enforcement official. Okay, emphasized, and so now that they're the experts during this time, they emphasize the need for law and order, and which means a crackdown on those associated with the drug. These findings are consistent with numerous other studies, including a study of network television news from 1990 and 1991, which found that a predictable us against them frame was used in the news stories with us being white suburban America and them being black Americans and a few corrupted whites. The media bonanza inspired by the administration's campaign solidified in the public imagination the image of the black drug criminal. Although explicitly because they even talk about this in the book. And by they, I mean Michelle Alexander, the author of this book. Let me find it. Oh my god, this just upsets me. Like, really upsets me. Okay. Okay, so this is from, like, just for an example. This, just as an example. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so this is about Nixon and this whole, like, war on poverty that was going on, that he was like, you know, there was a war on poverty. Okay, conservatives could point to support for highly punitive approaches to dealing with the problems of the urban poor as proof that race had nothing to do with their law and order agenda. So again, they were, cracking down on loitering. You don't have a job, you're loitering. Okay, well, we're just cracking down on poverty. No, you're not. You're cracking down specifically on black people. Okay, and then there's this here, a little excerpt. Okay, so it says, H.R. Halderman, one of Nixon's key advisors, recalls that Nixon himself deliberately pursued a Southern racial strategy. President Nixon emphasized that you have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes this while not appearing to. Similarly, John L. Rickman, I hope I said that right, special counsel to the president, explained the Nixon administration's campaign strategy of 1968 in this way. We'll go after the racists. And L. Rickman's view that subliminal appeal to the anti-black voter was always present in Nixon's statement and speeches. Subliminal. Dog whistle. Are these terms making sense to us people? Oh my god. This is just like... So anyway, it's not that crazy to believe that they're able to, like we're being fed nonsense here. As I'm reading this, I'm like, as I'm reading, my god, sorry guys, my fiance's a lot. As I'm reading this chapter 3, I'm like, okay, I could see the argument that, like, you can't really prove that, I gotta lower this a little bit, he's being so loud. He's playing on with his friends. Okay. Anyway, like I was saying, so yeah, there's, like, the belief that, oh my god, he's literally screaming. Oh, it's not on, guys. Sorry, even I, like, lost my train of thought there. Okay, as I'm reading chapter 3, and, she's explaining, like, people are very skeptical about the idea that, like, we are actually discriminating against racially discriminating against, and that's how our justice system works, and blah blah blah. I'm kind of like, yeah, I can see people being skeptical about that. I'm gonna feed into that skepticism. Let me see, how is she gonna convince me? Wait a goddamn minute. I don't need convincing, okay? This has been in our faces forever. This way that they're able to, like, well, if your grandfather couldn't vote, then that means you can't vote. They were able to pass stuff like that. They know that now, because of the Fourth Amendment, they can't discriminate against you. Or not Fourth Amendment, sorry, 14th Amendment, they can't discriminate against you because of your race. But they didn't say I couldn't discriminate against you because your grandfather couldn't vote. You know what I mean? Or the crazy literacy tests. Obviously, they are specifically going after a demographic. A way to paint this picture. Sorry to get graphic on this channel here for a moment here, but that's like saying, like, if you are an individual that menstruates, you're unable to vote. Hold up. Who do you think they're going? You know what I mean? Like, are we getting the picture here? Are we getting the picture here? They didn't say women. Prove it. Prove it. Prove it, you know? Or if your hair grows past your, like, if you have, like, your hair grows past your shoulders, or, like, I don't know, some other, like, thing that women typically have, but, like, other people could technically, like, men could also technically have longer hair, but women predominantly have longer hair, so you're probably discriminating against women. You get what I'm saying? Okay. Alright, well, anyway, wow, that's just wild. Okay, blah 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 blah. There are certain code words that allow you never to have to say race, but everybody knows that's what you mean, and crime is one of those. So when we talk about locking up more and more people, what we're really talking about is locking up more and more black men. Another commentator noted it is unnecessary to speak directly of race today because speaking about crime is talking about race. Indeed, not long after the drug war was ramped up in the media and political discourse, almost no one imagined that drug criminals could be anything other than black. A survey was conducted in 1995 asking the following questions. Would you close your eyes for a second, envision a drug user, and describe that person to me? The startling results were published in the Journal of Alcohol and Drug Education. 95% of respondents pictured a black drug user, while only 5% imagined other racial groups. These results contrast sharply with the reality of drug crime in America. African Americans constituted only 15% of current drug users in 1995, and they constitute roughly the same percentage today. Whites constituted the vast majority of drug users then and now, but almost no one pictured a white person when asked to imagine what a drug user looks like. The same group of respondents also perceived the typical drug trafficker as black. There is no reason to believe that the survey results would have been any different if police officers or prosecutors, rather than the general public, had been the respondents. Law enforcement officials, no less than the rest of us, have been exposed to the racially charged political rhetoric and media imagery associated with the drug war. In fact, for nearly three decades, news stories regarding virtually all street crime have disproportionately featured African Americans. One study suggests that the standard crime news script is so prevalent and so thoroughly racialized not surprisingly, people who have the greatest explicit bias as measured by self-reported answers to survey questions against a racial group tend to also have the greatest implicit bias against them and vice versa. Yet, wait, I don't understand that. Not surprisingly, people who have the greatest explicit bias. Oh, okay, also have the greatest implicit bias. Okay, sorry. Yet, there is often a weak correlation between degrees of explicit and implicit bias. Many people who think they are not biased prove, when tested, to have relatively high levels of bias. Unfortunately, a fairly consistent finding is that punitiveness and hostility almost always increase when people are primed, even subliminally, with images or verbal cues associated with African Americans. In fact, studies indicate that people become increasingly harsh when a criminal suspect is darker and more stereotypically black. They are more lenient when the accused is lighter and appears more stereotypically white. This is true of jurors as well as law enforcement officers. Man. Viewed as a whole, the relevant research by cognitive and social psychologists to date suggests that racial bias in the drug war was inevitable long as a minor traffic violation, such as failing to use a turn signal, exceeding the speed limit by a mile or two, tracking improperly between the lines, or stopping on a pedestrian walkway. Oh my god. Stopping on a pedestrian walkway can be identified. Police are free to stop motorists for the purpose of engaging in a fishing expedition for drugs. The pretext. I think we read about that, you guys. Okay. Such police conduct, the court concluded, does not violate the Fourth Amendment's ban on unreasonable searches and seizures. For good reason, the petitioners and Wren argued that granting police officers such broad discretion to investigate virtually anyone for drug crimes created a high risk that police would exercise their discretion in a racially discriminatory manner, with no requirement that any evidence of drug activity actually be present before launching a drug investigation. Police officers' snap judgments regarding who seems like a drug criminal would likely be influenced by prevailing racial stereotypes and bias. Let's stop there for a moment. I want to say, didn't some judge say that this was like the first step towards like totalitarianism, because now the police basically can just do whatever the hell they want? Especially now with this whole like, yeah, if they stop you on the pretext of that, that's fine. Okay, anyway. Did we read about that together? I can't remember. I think we did, you guys. Okay. They urged the court to prohibit the police from stopping motorists for the purpose of drug investigations unless the officers actually had reason to believe a motorist was committing or had committed a drug crime. Failing to do so, they argued, was unreasonable under the Fourth Amendment and would expose African Americans to a high risk of discriminatory stops and searches. Okay, I'm gonna stop there for a moment. Here's my thing, and I might sound crazy to say this, but even if we, like, okay. Yeah, okay, so, like, even if, like, we said, like, no, like, a police officer can't use a drug stop, or can't use, like, a traffic violation as a reason to stop you, they have to actually believe that you have drugs. Couldn't they, like, how do we prove that they actually believe that you had drugs? Like, what is the paperwork they have to do? Can't they just lie on that paperwork? You know what I mean? Like, I think of that, too. I'm like, what's really gonna stop them? Like, what way is it that they can prove that they really did think so? I don't know. Okay, anyway. Not only did the court reject the petitioner's central claim that using traffic stops as a pretext for drug investigations is unconstitutional, it ruled that claims of racial bias could not be brought under the Fourth Amendment. In other words, the court barred any victim of racial discrimination by the police from even alleging a claim of racial bias under the Fourth Amendment. Why? Okay, according to the court, whether or not police discriminate on the basis of race when making traffic stops is irrelevant to a consideration of whether their conduct is reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. I mean, I guess I understand that, because maybe one could argue that, like, okay, wait, let me finish reading this before I start talking. Okay. The court did offer one caveat. However, if indicated that victims of race discrimination could still state a claim. It indicated that victims of race discrimination could still state a claim under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal treatment under the laws. This suggestion may have been reassuring to those unfamiliar with the court's equal protection jurisprudence. Am I saying that word right? Jurisprudence. But for those who have actually tried to prove race discrimination under the 14th Amendment, the court's remark amounted to cruel irony. As we shall see below, the Supreme Court has made it virtually impossible to challenge racial bias in the criminal justice system under the 14th Amendment, and it has barred litigation of such claims under federal civil rights laws as well. Alright guys, I'm gonna cut it here, even though this next section is about to go crazy. I'm gonna cut it here, I'm getting tired. But, okay, really quickly. I guess I kind of understand the Fourth Amendment, like why they're saying you can't bring up racial bias under the Fourth Amendment, because the Fourth Amendment is simply like you have the right to no search and seizure. It doesn't say like regardless of race, so like one could assume that it's just like any American has that right. It has nothing to do with race. So like, why are you bringing up race? Because I suppose like within the context of the Fourth Amendment, like you can't really. There's nothing to argue within that context about race. With like again within the context of just the Fourth Amendment, I can understand that. From like just like a on paper kind of a thing, I don't think that is a completely unreasonable like answer, I guess. But yes, the whole like 14th Amendment, that's very important, that everyone has equal treatment under the laws. And, you know, one of those laws is the fact the Fourth Amendment, and this person is not getting equal treatment to that law specifically because of their race. But now, I guess the book is about to get into how it's very hard to win a 14th Amendment case in the courts. So, anyway, okay. I don't know what else to say. Hopefully this was... I say I'm